Shooting in manual mode can seem really intimidating and honestly kind of scary. There are so many settings and you're not quite sure which ones do what and what are the best settings to use. So my goal for today's video is to be able to take something that can be really complex and intimidating and make it really simple so that you can move confidently into shooting in manual mode on your next session. Hey friends, welcome back to my channel. I'm your host, Rebecca Rice, and I teach family photographers how to gain a life of financial freedom through a thriving photography business. In today's episode, we're talking all about how to shoot in manual mode. So this is going to be a great one. Before we get too far, I wanted to let you know about a free class that I have just for you guys. It's the 5 steps to launching your photography side gig. So maybe you're watching and you have a full-time job. Maybe you're a stay-at-home mom. I don't know what your situation looks like for you. But in this class, I walk you through the steps that you need to know to move from a hobby to having an actual legit business as your side gig. So if that is you, we've got it linked below. You can go register for that class and we'd love to see you there. It's completely free and no strings attached. We just want to help and serve as many people as we can. So go check out that class for sure. So the first thing that I want to address when it comes to manual mode is why is shooting in manual mode even important in the first place? This is a question that I get a lot, especially from those newer photographers who find automatic mode really easy, which it is. It is easy, but the benefit of moving from automatic mode into manual mode is it gives you control. I don't know about you, but I'm kind of a control freak, so I love it. But in automatic mode, the camera is basically taking information in through its sensors and making an educated guess of what the best settings would be. It's right sometimes, but a lot of the times it's not as fine-tuned as it can get if we shoot in manual mode. Your camera doesn't have eyes like you do, so it can't see what you're seeing. It's literally just taking in information based on the light around, and it's making that educated guess. So we want to move from an educated guess into certainty of this is exactly what I want my settings to be based on what my eyes are seeing. When you move into manual mode, you get to tell your camera exactly what it should be doing. Instead of it having a mind of its own, you, the one with the eyes, gets to tell the camera exactly what you're seeing and what it should be doing based off of what you're seeing. So there are 3 main settings when it comes to manual mode that we're going to talk about. It is your aperture, your ISO, and your shutter speed. So I'll go through these one at a time to understand what they do and what the numbers mean and everything like that. So your aperture is controlling how blurry the background is in your photo. That's that little number that's f/a number, right? Also called your f-stop. So the higher the f-stop, the higher that number is, the less blurry the background is, and also the darker your image is going to be, because the more you raise that f-stop, you are closing in the amount of light that is allowed into your lens. And so not only is it making the background less blurry, but it's also darkening your overall image. Now, when you lower that f-stop, it makes the background of your image more blurry, and it also brightens your photo. So a great place, depending on what lens you have, some lenses have a limit of how low they can go. That's like somewhere around 4 or 5 f-stop. Some other lenses that you can invest in go down even lower. So my very favorite lens that I shoot on is my 85mm 1.4. That means that it can go down to an aperture of 1.4. Now I will say, just because a lens can go down that low doesn't mean that it should. Every lens kind of has a sweet spot, and so I like to stay around 2.4, 2.8 f-stop. Now, on the lens that I upgraded to the very first time, I had my kit lens, which is my lens that came with my Canon Rebel. I upgraded to a 50mm 1.8, and I shot on that lens for a long time. And so that lens could go down to 1.8, but again, the sweet spot was really around 2.8. So the more that you shoot, the more that you understand where the sweet spot is, because if you go too low, you're gonna have a hard time getting your subject in focus. And the reason for that is the lower the aperture, also the smaller the focus area is. And so if I'm wanting a super creamy background, but I've got a toddler who can't stop moving, you want to be careful not to put your aperture too low, because you're going to have a hard time nailing that focus. So around the 2.8, before, when I had a harder time nailing my focus, it takes a lot of practice to get really great at focus. So before, when I was still kind of struggling, I stayed really around like 3.2, because that helps me to get more of my image in focus. Another thing to note with aperture is if you have more people in your photo, you need to raise your aperture as well to kind of compensate for that, because remember, that small aperture means a small focus area, where if you're shooting a family of 6, if you're shooting too low, your aperture is too low, then the people on the outsides or in the front or the back just are not going to be in focus. And so the more people you have, the higher that you do need to go for your aperture. Now, the next setting we're going to talk about is your ISO. So your ISO is the one that has the numbers that are in increments of 100, 100, 200, 400, whatever. Your ISO is basically controlling how much light is allowed into your lens. So the lower the ISO, the darker your photo. The higher the ISO, the lighter the photo, the more light that is allowed in. Now, ISO honestly is like the biggest contributor to your light, and it's the one that I adjust most often for big adjustments when it comes to lighting. And I'll talk about that in just a second, of like the order that I set my settings in, but just know ISO always plays a huge role in the light. Now, the last setting that I want to talk about is your shutter speed, which is what it sounds like. It controls how fast your camera clicks. So the higher your shutter speed, the faster your camera is going to click. And when your camera clicks faster, less light is allowed in, right? It makes sense, because when you snap really fast, it doesn't have a lot of time to draw light into your image, right? And so that higher that shutter speed, the darker your image is going to be. But also, the higher your shutter speed, the more movement or motion you'll be able to catch still. And so I shoot a lot of toddlers or families with young toddlers. And in those cases, I like to keep my shutter speed pretty high, just because they move a lot. They're wiggly kids. They have a hard time just sitting still. If you're like a senior portrait photographer, you can have a lower shutter speed, because seniors just don't move as much. So depending on what you need, if you're doing sports photography, you want to have a higher shutter speed. All things to consider. Now, when you have a lower shutter speed, it allows more light into your image, because the shutter snaps slower and it allows more time for the light to come in. So it does have a brighter image with that lower shutter speed. But it also gives more opportunity to get blurry images, especially if you've got those wiggly kids, because if you've got your shutter speed too low, then the shutter's going to snap slowly and you're not going to be able to freeze your wiggly toddlers. So there is like a balancing act of where that sweet spot is for setting your shutter speed, so that it's fast enough to have your photos in focus and sharp, but slow enough that you get enough light into your image. The last setting that I did want to mention, I forgot to mention at the beginning, but that is worth mentioning in manual mode, is your white balance. So your white balance is just the colors that are, portrayed in the image that you capture. The colors can be fixed in post-processing in Lightroom or in Photoshop, but it's a lot easier if you get them right in camera. And in manual mode, you're able to set that white balance and fine tune it so that you get it correct in camera. That, I think, is one of the biggest things that automatic mode on your camera gets wrong, is that your camera just has a really hard time, especially if you're using auto white balance. It just doesn't do that well. And so I highly suggest, if not for no other reason, that you use manual mode for the white balance because it makes a huge difference. So with your white balance, there are a couple ways that you can, set that white balance. You can use a gray card or an expo disc for a custom white balance, but the one that I'm going to talk about is using Kelvin. So Kelvin mode is the setting on your white balance that it has these numbers like 3200 or 6400, and basically what that means is the lower the number, the cooler the image. The higher the number, the warmer the image. So if you take a test shot and it's a really blue, then you can bump up your Kelvin number to make it warmer and bring in some more of that yellow-orange. A great way to set your Kelvin white balance is to switch to live mode on your camera, so where it actually shows up on the back of your screen and you're not looking through the viewfinder. So switch to live mode, that way you can see changes in real time. Then you can click your white balance button and you can scroll through your Kelvin and see when you make it lower, what does it do to the image? When you make it higher, what does it do? And you find that sweet spot that's close enough to what your eye is actually seeing. Like I mentioned, this can be fixed in post-processing, but it's a lot easier for editing if you get it right in camera. Okay, so my steps that I take to set my settings, I use the same order every single time, and it makes it easier to, process what all of the different settings do, knowing that some of them you can set and forget for that session. So I always start first and foremost with my white balance. I want to get my white balance correct first because typically I can let my white balance stay what it is unless you're like moving to different locations or maybe the sun comes out or something like that. That's when you'll need to adjust your white balance again. But for the most part, you can set your white balance, and as long as the lighting stays the same for that session, you can just leave it. After my white balance, I always set my aperture because for me, typically for a family session, I will set the aperture one time and just leave it for the whole session. There's not a need to be changing it all the time. So if there are settings that I can set and then not touch, it's minimizing the amount of settings that I do have to change. So after my aperture is set and I'm not touching it, the next thing that I adjust is my ISO. I had mentioned before that my ISO is what I use to make big changes in the light that I need. And so I'll set my ISO, and typically I don't have to change it very much. Now, I look at it again here in just a second, and I'm going to walk through that when I get to the rest of the steps. But once I have my ISO nailed in, then I don't really have to touch it much typically in a session. Now, after I have my ISO set, that's when I set my shutter speed. And sometimes, let's say I have my ISO on 100 because it's a really bright day and I don't need a lot of extra light in my image. So I set my ISO as low as it'll go to 100, and then I set my shutter speed. Well, I may have a super fast shutter speed because my image is still too bright and I can't lower my ISO anymore. So I'm going to crank that shutter speed until it's dark enough and not too bright in the image. Let's go on the other side of things. Let's say that it's a dark day and I raise my ISO. You want to be careful not to go too high in your ISO because that's when grain starts to be introduced to your images. So if I get to, I'll set my ISO to 800 maybe on a cloudy day, it's dark, whatever. I'll set it to 800 and then I'll adjust my shutter speed. Let's say I need more light in the image, so I lower my shutter speed, but I don't want to go too low, remember, because I don't want my photos to be blurry. I want it to be able to capture movement. So if I go down to like 1/200, then I don't like to go really below that. So if I get it down and it's still not bright enough, that's when I adjust my ISO again. So I'll adjust my shutter speed and my ISO together depending on what the photo is. So typically I'll set my settings of like my guess of what it's going to be, and then I'll take a tester shot. And if that shot is too dark, then I adjust my shutter and my ISO to brighten up the picture. If the picture's too bright, then I adjust my shutter speed to make it darker. Remember, the ISO is for big shifts in, the amount of light allowed in, and the shutter speed is for those micro adjustments that if you need just a little bit brighter, adjust your shutter speed and not your ISO. Well, that's all I have for you guys. Hopefully this was helpful in making this scary manual mode not so scary. Be sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video, and be sure to watch for next week's video where I'm going to walk you through the settings that I use on a cloudy day, on a sunny day outdoors, and settings that I use indoors to really be a starting place for fine-tuning from there. We'll see you next time.